please, I'd like to have our panel come up. We're going to have a final panel discussion of the day that I hope will tie a few things together that we've been discussing throughout the day and maybe leave us with a few practical ideas and some space for discussion in this evening and going forward. Very happy to have an amazing group of people with us today to talk about overcoming obstacles and changing the rules of the game at the global level. Some of the folks up here you've already met. Some of them you will meet tomorrow if you haven't met. So I'll start with Pedro, who you remember this morning, founder of Sistema. Federico Ovejero is the correct way to say it, yes? Federico is the VP of Environmental Affairs or Environment and Corporate Affairs or Sustainability and Corporate Affairs for LATAM at Unilever. And you met Sally this morning, the Executive Director at Forum for the Future. Some of you may have met Rick Ridgeway. If you haven't, you will have a chance to do so tomorrow. Rick is the VP of Environmental Affairs for Patagonia. And on my left is Raphael Bemporad. Raphael is the Chief Strategy Officer at BBMG. Go ahead and clap. I'm a fan. I will say that I'm delighted to know all of these people, and at least, if not individually, the work of their organizations, a couple of them here personally for quite some time. And each of them is doing really significant work in trying to overcome the many systemic obstacles that we face to trying to shift the world to a sustainable economy. So I thought I would just take a quick minute to run down some of the obstacles that we have heard come up today in our conversations, and then just open up to a conversation about how each of you is working to overcome some of these obstacles. Sally brought up three of them in her presentation this morning. She mentioned the problem of short-term investment thinking. She mentioned the lack of enabling policy that supports system shift, and she mentioned disengaged consumers. Probably the words aren't exactly right, but I think that's the right ideas. Yes? Okay. I appreciated that Pedro brought up in his comments to us this morning the issue of our disconnection from ourselves and from each other, and that is a handicap that we face that we have to overcome. We had lots of discussion about something that I care very much about, which was connected to the limited measures of success, or the limits of the way that we view value and how we define value and measure value. Many people mentioned that today. And then the other one that I heard this morning in a few different directions was really the lack of willingness or skills to collaborate. And so these are some of the obstacles that I know that each of you are addressing, and I thought maybe we'd just start down the top of the list and have an open discussion from your perspective and experience. And I don't like that I have to turn my back on each of you. I'd love to have you closer in. But let's start with this whole issue of short-term investment. I know one of the things that inspires us at home in the U.S., and I think many business leaders particularly, is Paul Pullman's courage and leadership in standing up on this issue and really being willing to put himself on the line around his commitment to avoiding quarterly earnings reports, for example. Do you want to speak a little bit about that, how it's impacted you at Unilever and how you see it impacting your peers?
Yes. Well, hello to everybody first, and thank you for inviting me today. Well, yes, Pullman, when he arrived to the company, he always tells us that what he told the shareholders was that he was not going to work for the shareholders, but he was going to work for improving the life of the consumers. So that was shocking at the beginning. Even the stock price fell down at the beginning. But then they realized that what he was talking was what the company business should do, you know. I mean, and what we have been experiencing the last 5 years is a business growth, you know, very important, and mainly because he focused on what he said, improving the life of the people. And that is why, as one of his first decisions was to review our whole mission in the company. And he defined as double the size of the business by 2020 by reducing half of our environmental footprint, but at the same time improving the life of billions of our consumers. If you take in mind that every day, we reach to more than 2 billion consumers who is using any of our products all around the world, it was a very important challenge. But at the same time, what he said was sustainability must be at the heart of what we do. And I think that is a key element for us. And of course, it's an ongoing issue because not everybody feels like that at the beginning. I mean, it's very easy to identify or to confuse sustainability with CSR and to leave, the corporate affairs guys to take care of that, and let us discuss about the business, the corporate affairs talk about sustainability. And, his revolutionary, I would say, at least for the company, idea was that every area of the company should define the Unilever Sustainable Living Plan ambition, as we say, USLP, and that ambition should mean business growth for the company. So sustainability not only to be discussed again as CSR, but to be discussed as part of our business. And at the same time, and I'm close with that, he advocated that before different external environments, because it's not only important to do that within the company, but also before the different fora. Polman is one of the 15 members of a high-level panel who's working with Ban Ki-moon in defining the post-2015 Millennium Goals. So he's very, very passionate about that, and of course he inspires everybody in the company as well.
So demonstrating leadership is not only influences you, but the rest of the business community, the peers that stand behind him and his leadership. It certainly demonstrates one of the aspects that we commit to, which is the idea of the courageous optimist is what our community is about. Pedro, the B Corp certification, this is one of the intentions of establishing this business. We don't want to call it a certification, but we want to call it what do we want to call it?
I would call it a passport to a big community, a new identity, and a new market identity, and a new legal type.
But one of the intentions that putting this system in place was to help influence or give permission, let's say, to companies to think beyond just quarterly returns. Yes?
Absolutely. Well, the fact that you actually place a social or an environmental purpose in the mission statement of your charter, that structures the governance of the company. And a purpose is not a dimension. A purpose is systemic and it's holistic. Purposes are not just unidimensional. So once you have a holistic purpose as the ultimate and the highest purpose of a company, then the company starts behaving in a different way. It's not only a matter of a brand or a matter of selling goods. Of course, you transcend that with a message. And but I need to say something, KoAnn. I just feel that the sharing barriers is legitimate, but barriers are ultimately within ourselves. Absolutely. It's cultural, and it's up to us if we want to overcome barriers with creativity. I mean, we have so much creativity and innovation on technology. What about actually looking at ourselves? We're invited by Albert Einstein to do that. Why not?
Well, I think that was one of the points that we brought up from this morning that we definitely want to touch on, for sure. I want to just connect the 2 points. The fact that you're talking about that having a cohesive purpose really changes your behavior, and I like the way that's played out for a brand, a very sizable and very fast-growing brand in the U.S. called Chipotle. If you haven't seen the brand, it's a worthwhile case to look into. But Chipotle is an example of a company that decided its purpose early on, and when it went to pursue early investment in its business, it made it clear that it was going to behave in the way that Unilever's talking about wanting to behave, in the way you're talking about behaving, by letting its investors know up front that if the price of local food or healthy food, the sustainable food source went up, it wasn't going to change its decisions about how it operated, and that anybody who chose to invest in the company needed to be prepared for that and ready for that. So at the beginning of the company, they aligned expectations, their investor expectations, and that created an environment where there was a shared mission between the investment community and their behavior. And that's very helpful, and the company has just done fantastically well, continues to grow. I believe it's still the fastest growing fast food company in the US. That's great. So then the next thing we talked about in terms of obstacles, and I absolutely take your point that obstacles are only a point for bringing creativity to the game, was this issue of lack of enabling policy. And this is something we've been working on in our community for a while, recognizing that a lot of the work that's been done in the sustainability departments and increasingly into brand innovation has not made its way into corporate affairs or into the lobbying office of the business. And there still is, in many cases, a disconnect there. Who would like to talk about that a little bit? And I don't know if you have any comments about that, Rick.
About policy?
Yes, about influencing policy.
Yes. Well, first of all, KoAnn, thank you for the invitation to join this group. It's absolutely encouraging to see so many people so committed to sustainability in Argentina. I really applaud all of you for your dedication. A privilege to be here. I am so heartened to hear from Pedro about the effort to advance B corporations here in Argentina as well. That is a fantastic movement. I applaud Unilever for their efforts globally. They're really profound. A few years ago, they purchased Ben & Jerry's ice cream in the United States. It's the first publicly held company in the U.S. to become a B corporation. So they deserve a lot of compliment. Yeah, they deserve credit for that as well. Federico, I don't know if you know, but I'm part of your company's sustainability council in North America. So I work closely with Paul and with Case Khrushchev-Telinius, the CEO of your North American business. But let's get to the question: how do you influence policy? To put that into a framework, in earlier discussions this morning, I've heard comments about the single biggest obstacle to all of us or the single biggest challenge is somehow to internalize the externalities of our businesses. How do you bring into the cost structure of our businesses the impact that the productions of our products have on our planet and on our societies that currently are not measured, that currently are not integrated into the cost of our products? And as I think that challenge through, the only way to solve it is with policy. Imagine this, that if the shirt that I have on were made in places where the governments taxed and penalized anybody growing cotton that wasn't using organic processes, that was drawing down water tables, that was making that cotton in any way unsustainable. Imagine the policies where the shirt was manufactured that penalized and taxed any factories who were discharging toxics into the river. Imagine that if all the externalities of my shirt were by those taxes and extra cost internalized into the product, then when you went to buy this shirt, the shirt that was made with the least harm to the earth would be the least expensive. And we would no longer have to rely on ourselves to pay those margins for products that are made more sustainably, just because we're dedicated to it and we can afford it. That, to me, is the ultimate challenge. That, to me, is the ultimate goal for all of us in the room. That is when we truly will achieve sustainability. So how do we get there? You know, that's your question. I don't want to take up the rest of the time because it's an enormously difficult question. In our industry in apparel, though, we do have a theory of change about how to do that. It starts with measurement. We have convened a group of apparel and footwear companies into a coalition to work together to develop tools to measure our footprints, both environmental and social. The group has grown enormously. It's less than 4 years old. We now, I was telling Pedro at lunch, you know, we now have in this group 40% of the global dollars for apparel and footwear on planet Earth. Within a year, we'll be at 50%. That means that wherever you're at in the world, every other person you see will be wearing clothes made by somebody in this group who's all using standardized measurement tools, who is using those tools to create benchmarks against which they can measure themselves to any other company in the industry, and through that measurement begin to lower their impacts. But what we're really up to, what our real theory of change is that through that measurement and the transparency of it, we can begin to influence governments. Because once you measure, once you put out there what the true impact of making stuff is on the planets and on the planet's societies, then you begin to build consensus across constituencies, with governments, with civil societies, to everyone working together and collaborate, produce those policies which will internalize the externalities.
Great answer, absolutely great answer. And I think, again, measurement in some way, shape, or form helps us quantify the problem and point out specific areas of leverage that we can work toward. That brings us to a nice segue, which is around collaboration and the challenge to collaborate. It's one of the things that we recognize is that you can't do something like that on your own. And SAC, the Sustainable Apparel Coalition, has been an absolute amazing case of competitors coming together to begin to work on a problem. We're seeing more and more of this. Sally, you have a lot of experience actually in convening stakeholder groups to help work on establishing policy shift. What do you find in terms of conditions for setting up productive collaboration? What kinds of conditions have to exist, and how do you, if somebody's interested in building a coalition of the willing, what do you find it takes?
It takes a lot of determination, oftentimes. Can you hear me okay?
Yes.
Yeah, great. So first of all, it takes determination, and the more that people say no, they don't want to do this, the more I personally keep going, because it means that you're onto something. But the kind of collaborations that we are interested in pulling together at Forum are those that are trying to address these challenges that are too big for one organisation to tackle alone. And key success factors are 1, 2, or 3 anchor partners, so 2 or 3 businesses that share a common challenge and are willing to invest time and energy to pull in a greater cohort of businesses. And that's how the SAC got started. So you need 2 or 3 anchor partners. You then need a burning platform. And we've managed to successfully deliver 3 or 4 collaborations where we've brought entire systems together. That's my 3rd success criteria. But where there's been a shared sense of urgency to act. For each collaboration that we've successfully delivered, there's one that didn't go anywhere because actually the need for change just wasn't strong enough. So, for example, we wanted to do some work looking at the future of grain supplies. So we wanted to pull together the grain producers, the grain processors, the end users, to look at how do we navigate the complexities of the most sustainable use of our land. So do we use our land for food? Do we use it for fuel? Do we use it for feed? Because these are all tensions that we don't really know how to navigate and will impact on availability of grain. But whilst everyone understands that there's a set of complicated issues there, actually the volatility in the grey market isn't enough really to bring everyone together. And you have lots of futures traders that think, yeah, we can just trade our way out of it. So that's an example of a collaboration that went nowhere. It's in the cupboard though, so if anyone is interested, do let me know. But you need the anchor partners, you need a burning platform. So for the collaboration, what we're doing on tea, which Unilever was one of our anchor partners, the tea industry, so that cup of tea that we all like and love, it's not secure in terms of its future. I mean, the challenges are enormous from people don't want to work on tea plantations, number one, and actually the value going through the chain is really difficult. So you need the burning platform. And then number three, you need the system in the room. Often we find that by bringing together the producers with the processors, with the retailers, with the NGO groups, you can find new insights and new solutions. And to go to your point, Pedro, absolutely, change starts with experiencing the need for change. We have a change curve that I trot out at any available opportunity, but I'm not going to do it right now. It's on our website. But step one is experiencing the need for change. And then you need to diagnose a system and understand where those levers are that you can push. And to do that, you need the system in the room, because without that, you might conceive of some solution that works for one part of a value chain but won't work for the rest. And actually that's often the hardest bit, because for the work that we did in the dairy sector in the UK, people said you'll never do this, because at that point the dairy farmers weren't talking to the dairy processors, who weren't talking to the farmers union. And that was again another reason why I thought, right, I'm going to keep going with this. And when we pulled them together for the first meeting, it was the first time that the National Farmers Union, so the body representing dairy farmers in the UK, had spoken to the processing people for 3 years, because relationships had deteriorated so much. So bringing the system in the room is really important. And at Forum, because we're an NGO with nothing more to achieve than a sustainable future, we can hold that space and create that neutrality that allows these difficult conversations and starts to broker solutions. So they're just a few things.
So you're one of the ONGs that is really focused on helping deliver solutions as opposed to driving pain for brands who, from the perspective of the ONG, really need to make a change. We're seeing a lot of interesting shift in the relationship between ONGs and businesses in terms of how they're working together to try to drive a little bit more urgency for brand change. Anybody have any comment on that?
Well, as Ali was saying, we are working with Forum for the Future, and I can say that has been an enriching experience from what my people tell me in London and in other parts of the world. We're beginning to work with them here in Latin America too now. But what is important also is, as you said, instead of playing, I would say, who's the most environmentalist, of all. I think that, as Rick said, working together, I think, is the only way to really make this world a more sustainable place to live. And for example, we are working with our providers of agricultural raw materials. We have one of our goals that we have for 2020 is to source 100% for sustainable raw materials from agriculture. So, the only way to do that is to be able to work with them in developing them, also identify institutions, credible institutions, serious institutions who can certify, that production. Sometimes it's not easy, because sometimes at the beginning it may cost you more, But if you have very clear, what you want to achieve at the end, is the only way to solve it.
Are you experiencing a change in the relationship that you're having with more NGOs who have typically been seeing you as the enemy and been less willing to see you as a partner?
Yeah, I think that as long as we show that we walk the talk, as they say, that we are committed and we accomplish what we do, what we commit, I think that they respect us more and more. I always say that there are two kinds of companies, or two kinds of companies. The ones who adapt, sustainability to their way of working, to their way of doing business, and the one who adapt their business to sustainability, and everybody sees, the difference. The first ones are short term, and everybody understands that they don't really want to make a change.
I know that the Sistema Bay group is working on really building communities of interest, and that having a shared vision within a group of businesses really helps create cohesion and collaboration and change. Anything you would comment on that, Pedro?
Well, yes, you have the B2B value chains, of course, but let's face it. I mean, we're talking about a paradigm shift. We're talking about evolution, and this is the evolution of our own civilization. So we need to figure out new ways of actually sharing the path. And one thing that Sistema B, but also with Social Lab, with Ashoka, and with 30 other partners, started 1 year ago in Santiago, Chile, was to create the civil society, or I would say society movement of conversations on the evolution of economics. And they started with what Fabio showed us today. They started with music on the parks. 50,000 people were at the International Festival of Social Innovation last year in Santiago, and this is being expanded now to Guadalajara, probably to Buenos Aires and Rio, and probably to Montevideo, where you have the conversations, where you have music that opens your spirit, your heart, and immediately after that, with people like Tonolek, I mean, these are the musicians down in this part of the world, Tonolek, Charlie Garcia, Fito Páez, I mean, these guys who are quite well known in this part of the world. And what they do, they open up your heart. That means they open up your right side of the brain. And immediately after that, you have a conversation with a little panel. Gonzalo Muñoz, who's another founder of Sistema B, was there as a panelist and speaking out to 50,000 people on the parks and talking about who wants to live and work for a purpose-driven company. And there you have the 50,000 people, Viva Gonzalo, you see. And this is, I mean, we need to help each other as plain individuals to walk in that direction. I mean, I know that we all come from the idea of the theory, the Maslow theory, for example. Me, personally, I came from that. I mean, you build the theory of change, you design an amazing strategy, but it's only when you are subject to the infinite diversity of inspirations, joining hands and sharing, that probably we can walk in that direction.
Another great alignment. Are you,
Just a quick build on
please,
that.
no, yeah, absolutely.
Buenos tardes. It's a pleasure to be here. My name is Raphael Bemporad from BBMG. And just a quick build on what Pedro is saying. I think all of us are here and recognize the unique role that brands can play in moving toward a sustainable and flourishing future. The reason that brands are a lever of change, whether it's policy or innovation or looking at business models or systemic collaboration, is that brands are uniquely able to hold both sides of the story that's unfolding on the stage today. One side of that story is how we manufacture products and how we look at design and how we look at who makes our clothes and what's behind the products that we make, and that's important. But the other side of the story that brands uniquely hold is the soul and meaning and culture and inspiration and aspiration. And I think brands uniquely as entities in our society can hold both parts of this story and this journey. And when we can harness both elements of the brand, the power of business, the power of the marketplace, and the role that brands play in creating meaning and community, then we're onto something that can truly be transformational. And I think keeping in mind that brands are a lever of change is, I think, a key part of this journey that we're on and a key really strategy for change overall.
Actually, we agree.
Yeah.
We talked earlier, or Sally mentioned that this need to figure out a way to overcome disengaged consumers as a big obstacle. And Raphael, you've been doing a lot of work on trying to understand consumers. Talk a little bit about this is a sneak peek into what you'll share tomorrow, maybe. And
Absolutely. I think we're experiencing a lot of paradigm shifts and evolutions from the conversation today. And one of the things that speaks to the obstacle of disengaged citizens is actually a relatively large shift that's happening culturally and globally around the consumer and the role that consumers play with brands and in society. And what I'll share tomorrow in detail, but just give a notion of tonight, is the rise of an aspirational consumer who's uniting elements of materialism, things like a desire to purchase the products that meet their needs on a day-to-day basis, the desire for social status, for a sense of identity, those things that are traditionally drivers from materialism are being united with things like social and environmental values, the desire to feel like you belong to a community bigger than yourself, that your actions can make a difference, to express yourself creatively as part of a tribe. And so what's happening is, and this is significantly changing the marketplace in countries like China and India, looking at even countries in Africa like Nigeria. It's large here in Peru and in South America. But there's a rising consumer that is really shifting from an either-or perspective, which is either it's beautiful and affordable and accessible, or it's sustainable, to a both-and paradigm, which is no compromises. And brands like Nike and Patagonia and Chipotle and increasingly large multinationals like Unilever are designing without compromise. And I think there's a new future coming into focus that's being driven by innovation from great brands, but it's also being driven culturally. And I think the most important thing of shifting consumer behavior is that we're moving from sustainability as an obligation and simply the right thing to do to sustainability as desire and the cool thing to do. And brands like EcoCycle and EcoCycle and Will.i.am are showing there's a way of bringing these things together, blowing up Maslow's hierarchy and bringing all of these elements into one synthesis. And I think that's a really promising vision for the future where consumers are going to help to drive this change as well.
I was just going to say, go ahead.
I was going to add that, as some of you may know, at Patagonia for years now, we've had a little website called the Footprint Chronicles, where we try to, as transparently as we can, explain the supply chain of our products to our customers and to tell those stories through the people that are in the supply chain by profiling them and by giving a face to the provenance of your products. And we've just, we continue to evolve that effort. Just last week, we released a new version where when you go onto Patagonia.com and you go to the page for a specific product that you might be interested in, you can see the supply chain for that product right at the bottom of the page with photographs of the factories that made it, and then clicking on them, you'll get profiles of each fabric. We continue to evolve that. What we're up to is trying to partner with the part of civil society of you guys who are getting more interested in that and starting to demand it by trying to create a model for what we hope other companies can do to empower you guys to vote with your wallet, but also to know that it's your responsibility, as we heard earlier this afternoon, to know where your clothes come from, to know where all the consumer goods you purchase come from, and to demand from companies that they tell you that information. Ultimately, it's up to all of us as the users of products to make that demand, and then it'll happen.
I was just going to add something to what Raphael was saying. If we want to change really the minds of the consumers, be sustainable doesn't need to be more expensive. And this is a challenge that we have in our companies. We can do that. We have proven that being sustainable means less cost. You know, being able to, for example, all our facilities, all our plants in Argentina are zero waste to landfill. We're not throwing any waste to the outside. And that is reducing our costs, you know. And if we can, we are using those earnings, I would say, or less cost, to apply it in more investment to make more sustainable products. But in the end of the day, being sustainable again doesn't need to be more expensive. Otherwise, the consumers, it's very difficult for economies like Argentina, for example, to reassume a higher cost, for a very, important goal, but not so close to our needs today, to achieve.
Not so relevant in the food industry, but one of the things we're really interested in is trying to help recast the conversation for the consumer into one of total cost of goods or total value of a product rather than cost, because I think there's a lot of opportunity in driving home this notion that using a product like Patagonia, for example, their products are expensive, but they last forever, and so the total cost of use, particularly when you're supported in repair and so forth, can warrant or justify extra expense. But that's a mind shift. We've taught consumers, because we've, as marketers, competed so long on price, that now we've created a situation where that's the expectation, and we have to figure out how to shift that around. Just to mention something more, Rick, which some of you may not have seen, there's a brand in France that I really respect who's gone even the next step further in supply chain transparency to actually itemize the cost all the way down to the material of every aspect of their finished good. It's a fashion brand. And that is radical. When you start to really put on paper what the guy who's picking the cotton is making, and what the person who's weaving the material is making, and the person who's got making the buttons and all of that, that begins to enable a customer, as you say, to vote with their, be informed and vote with some much better sense of an educated decision making. Were you going to say something, Pedro, about this?
Well, not exactly about that.
There was something else. That's okay.
Yeah, you had this policy issue, and when I was hearing to all of you, I was just thinking that what Gandhi taught us, be the example you want to see, and it's only when you're the example that you actually put content to your language and to your wording, and you get the strength, to reach out to the policymakers. And then you do it not because you want a favor, you don't want a subsidy, you don't want a tax break. You basically want a framework that enables you to be the most of yourself and be sustainable. Yeah. So it's a totally different logic of lobbies. You see, it's not the lobby in the name of jobs and in the name of national interest that has harmed us so much, given that we have also the global interest.
Yeah, for me, the high note today was Nikos really bringing home this idea of cohesion, and we've been talking as a community globally about transparency for quite some time. Transparency is going to continue to be both a pressure and also a tool for brands, I think. This idea of authenticity, or one step further, integrity or cohesion, is incredibly powerful, and it speaks to your point around this need for us to get connected to what integrity looks like to us personally, and to reconnecting us with our humanity in our work every day. And I'm excited by seeing that whole conversation beginning to unfold. And it unfolds simply by being authentic. And when you see people around you that have learned what that means to be real in the world, it's pretty radical and impactful in surprising ways. And every time you as an individual become comfortable in saying your truth as you see it, whatever that is, you give permission to someone else to say their truth as they see it. And together we begin to be more authentic and more human, and that will continue, in my opinion, will continue to drive permission for our brands to be more authentic and human as well.
Too.
Yes, absolutely.
Specifically on the idea of coherence and integration, I think what you're saying, KoAnn, and Pedro's kicking it off, is the notion that we're at a moment in time where we can actually rethink what business means and actually ask ourselves, what does it mean for humanity to act in service of business and business to act in service of humanity in a loop of abundance and innovation. And that's a totally different way of looking at things like policy, totally different way of looking at things like systems thinking and design. And so what does it really mean to put humanity in business in all of the ways that might make sense, and allow our deepest humanity to make our businesses better, and allow the excellence of our business to bring out the best in our humanity?
Yes.
I
No permission. Jump in.
jump in. I guess I get all of that, and it all sounds lovely. I'm thinking about the people in different parts of the world, and even in the UK, where we're supposed to be a rich nation. Actually, the poverty divide and inequality has got worse over the last 5 years. The numbers of rich have increased and the number of poor has grown exponentially. In the UK last year, the number of food banks doubled. This is the UK. And I think that if you are a cash-strapped family and you've got a really tight budget, then conversations about humanity and so on, they just don't land. But what does land, though, and I think what you're pushing at, is the notion of values. And I think one of the conduits, one of the ways in which we can engage mainstream civil society on this debate is by exploring that notion of values. What was really interesting quite recently in the UK again, a couple of the big supermarkets, Sainsbury's and Asda, they're big and they sell to a really diverse demographic. It is not just the posh shoppers with lots of disposable income. These are people that don't have much income. And what they found is that people really care where their food comes from, particularly after we had a scandal where it turned out there was horse meat in beef burgers, which didn't go down very well. Since then, people care even more. And so I think what's really worth exploring and pushing is how can you help people think about value in a way that they are thinking through where their food comes from and that actually values matter. And Sainsbury's, again, in the UK, have just run a campaign called Values for Value's Sake, and are basically saying if you buy the banana from Sainsbury's and it's a fair trade banana, it's the same price. And it's being received really, really well. So I think if we can start to have a different conversation about value, yes, of course it's economic value, but it's also where things come from, and get that price point working, which is what's happening in Unilever and many other places, then I think we can start to democratize sustainability. And that's what we need to do. Sustainability needs to be available to everybody. And then get this, I think if we can do that, and you start to activate citizens, and I think that's entirely possible, particularly in this digital age, then we start to get engagement with civil society, and then what do? They put pressure on the policymakers. So one route to policy change for sure is to have the metrics and to make it really uncontestable that something needs to change. But one of the biggest reasons why, certainly in Europe and in the UK, policy changes aren't made because there's no votes in it. So how do we democratize sustainability so that there are votes in sustainability, so that everyday folk are demanding, why aren't you providing a solution to these big challenges? Then engagement with civil society actually unblocks that policy barrier too.
That's a beautiful observation, and similar things are happening in the US.
Well, just to comment on what you just mentioned about inequity or inequality, the system that we have designed has a DNA for corporations. The DNA has the clause of fiduciary liability, the duty to care for the shareholder, and that means the maximization of profit for the shareholder. Automatically, that means minimizing all the other costs, the social, the labor, the environmental costs. This by DNA. This doesn't mean that policy has not intervened to basically compensate that. But the DNA is still that one. So if we could reconsider by shareholder agreements, how much of our liability we want to really expand, there we would do a huge difference. If we could expand the fiduciary liability to all the stakeholders, then we include the long-term variables, we include the huge infinite diversity of considerations of all kinds into the governance of the company. Now, personally, I think that, I'm a fan of B Corps. Was that noticed? I don't know. Anyway, I'm a fan of B Corps. But nobody needs to become a B Corp to do this. I mean, any company that decides to do this can actually step forward. And you don't need to wait for legislation to do that. You could do it only through, you could do it right away with a shareholder agreement, you see, and amend your charter. So there's a lot that we already can do throughout the world, because all of the companies in the world follow still the DNA of the Industrial Revolution.
That's why tomorrow you will have here our CEO for Latin America, and you will hear from him that sustainability is a good business for us. But I believe, I agree with you, Pedro, but I believe that if we have a better legal environment in the countries that we operate, I think that we have more incentives, and probably the process of being more sustainable can go faster, because we cannot, run the risk of waiting too long, to make this happen. We only have one planet, and if we continue consuming the way we are now, we will need 2 or 3 planets, So it's a way of how fast we can move forward and how fast we can engage the rest of the society to work all together. And we need the government to be there as well.
So this is a key point that we can work on aligning around how to influence government policy and the investment community for sure. Well, this is a good time for us to wrap today. Our goal was really to just spark some more conversation to go on into the evening and for you to think about when you go home this evening and bring back tomorrow. We're going to let anybody who would like to go comfortably say goodbye, but some of us at least will stay around, and if anybody's interested in being engaged in a Q&A or for a further dialogue, we'll stay and take some more questions.